A white woman calls the cops on her black neighbor, claiming he looked suspicious. But when police arrive, she's the one in trouble. The man. She tried to get arrested. A powerful federal agent. What happens next is pure justice. The afternoon sun spilled golden light over the quiet suburban street, casting long shadows on the pavement. It was one of those peaceful days where everything felt just normal. The kind of day where people walked their dogs, kids rode their bikes, and neighbors exchanged polite nods from their porches. But for Karen Whitman, normal wasn't enough. From behind the lace curtains of her pristine two-story home, she clutched her phone in one hand, her fingers curling tightly around the edges. Her sharp blue eyes were locked on the man across the street, Darius King. A tall, well-dressed black man in his early 40s. He had just stepped out of his sleek black SUV, carrying what looked like a leather briefcase. Karen's heart raced, but not from fear, from something uglier, something colder. She watched as Darius calmly walked up the driveway of the house he had owned for the past 3 years, the one he worked tirelessly to afford, the one he called home. He didn't rush, didn't sneak. He simply existed. And that, to Karen, was the problem. She grabbed her phone, her breath quickening as she dialed 911. "There's a suspicious black man in my neighborhood," she hissed into the phone, her voice laced with artificial panic. "I think he's trying to break into a house. You need to send someone right now." Across the street, Darius paused as he reached his front door. He could feel it, that lingering gaze, the sharp sensation of being watched. He turned his head slowly, locking eyes with Karen through her window. She didn't look away, and that's when he knew. This wasn't the first time, but it would be the last. Darius exhaled slowly, his jaw tightening as he stood on his own front porch. He had been here before, maybe not in this exact moment, but in this exact feeling. The slow, sinking realization that no matter how successful he was, no matter how many degrees he held, how well he dressed, how polished his mannerisms were, to some people, he was still just a suspicious black man. He clenched his fists, but not in anger, in control. He wouldn't let this break him. Not today. Then the sound came, the shrill wail of sirens slicing through the quiet street. His stomach twisted, but his face remained unreadable as 2 police cruisers whipped around the corner, red and blue lights bouncing off the neatly trimmed lawns. The neighbors peeked out from their windows, their blinds shifting, their faces full of curiosity. Karen, still clutching her phone, stepped out onto her porch, her expression morphing into one of smug satisfaction. She crossed her arms, tilting her head in mock concern. Darius didn't move. He didn't have to. The first officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man, Officer Trent, stepped out of his vehicle, one hand resting dangerously close to his holster. His eyes immediately locked onto Darius, his posture stiffening. "Sir, step away from the door. Hands where I can see them." Darius sighed, already exhausted by the predictable routine. He raised his hands slowly, his movements deliberate, his heart pounding, but his face unreadable. "I live here," he said evenly. "This is my house." Karen scoffed loudly from her porch. "That's a lie!" she shrieked. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 15 years, and I've never seen him before. He's trying to rob the place." The officers exchanged glances, hesitation flickering across their faces. Trent turned back to Darius, stepping closer, his hand now fully gripping his holstered weapon. "Sir, I need you to turn around and place your hands on the wall." A ripple of quiet tension spread through the street. Darius held his ground. He didn't run. He didn't lash out. Instead, he did something that no one, not Karen, not the officers, not the watching neighbors, expected. He smirked, a slow, knowing smirk that sent a chill through the air. And then, in the calmest, most controlled voice, he spoke. "Officer, I'd think twice about what you do next." A heavy silence settled over the street. The tension, thick enough to cut with a knife, stretched between Darius and Officer Trent like a drawn bowstring, ready to snap. Karen smirked from her porch, arms crossed over her chest. She could already taste the victory. This was how it always worked, right? The cops arrive, they take her word, and the suspicious black man disappears. She'd watch him get humiliated, maybe even arrested, and then her neighborhood would be safe again. But today was different. Because Darius King wasn't just any man. He was a federal agent, and he was done playing nice. Trent narrowed his eyes at Darius. "Excuse me?" he asked, his grip tightening on his holster. Darius exhaled through his nose, calm and unbothered. "I said, you should think twice about what you do next." A flicker of uncertainty crossed Trent's face, but Karen scoffed. "Are you hearing this?" she snapped. "He's threatening you. Arrest him already." Darius let out a slow, measured breath before he spoke again. "Let me make this simple for you, officer," he said, his voice smooth, but carrying the weight of authority. "I'm reaching into my pocket, slowly. No sudden moves." Trent and his partner stiffened, hands twitching near their weapons. Click, click, body cams activated. The moment had shifted. Darius kept his movements deliberate, his fingers sliding into the inside pocket of his blazer. The entire street held its breath as he pulled out something small, black and official-looking. He flicked it open. A gold badge gleamed in the sunlight, its intricate lettering catching every last drop of golden light. Federal Bureau of Investigation. The moment Trent read the words, his entire demeanor collapsed. His shoulders tensed, his eyes widened in horror. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Karen's smirk vanished. The blood drained from her face so fast she nearly stumbled backward. Darius tilted his head slightly, studying Trent's reaction. "You still want me to turn around and put my hands up?" A ripple of disbelief spread through the gathered neighbors. Karen clutched her chest, her mouth flapping open and closed like a fish gasping for air. This has to be a joke," she sputtered. "That can't be real. You're lying." Darius didn't even glance at her. His eyes stayed locked onto Trent's. "Call it in." His voice was like steel. "Run my credentials. Go ahead, I'll wait." Trent swallowed hard. His hands, once so eager to grab his cuffs, were shaking now. His partner fumbled for his radio, his voice cracking as he called dispatch. "Dispatch, we need an urgent verification. Subject claims to be a federal agent. Badge number." As he rattled off the number, the seconds stretched into eternity. Then, crackle. The response came back. "Confirmed. Subject is Special Agent Darius King, assigned to the Bureau's Criminal Investigations Division, highest clearance level." A cold sweat broke out on Trent's forehead. Darius smiled slightly, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was the look of a man who had been waiting for this moment, waiting to watch them realize exactly how badly they had screwed up. Karen let out a choked gasp. No, that's not possible. I saw him. He was—" She trailed off, the truth crushing her. Darius turned. This time, he did look at her, and when he spoke, his words cut like a knife. "You saw what you wanted to see." Karen staggered back, the weight of her actions, the consequences about to rain down on her, finally hit. But it was already too late, because Darius wasn't done yet, and justice was only just beginning. Karen's breath came in short, ragged gasps. Her world was crumbling. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. She had called the cops to get rid of him, to put him in his place. But now, she was the one being stared at. She was the one in trouble. This is a misunderstanding," she stammered, stepping forward, hands trembling. "Officer, I thought he was breaking in. It was just a mistake, an honest mistake." Darius didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He had seen this play out before. The sudden shift from arrogance to desperation. The frantic scrambling to dodge accountability. But this time, there would be no easy way out. Officer Trent's hand slowly fell away from his holster, his face locked in a stiff mask of controlled panic. The reality of the situation had finally sunk in. He had almost arrested a federal agent. Worse, he had almost pulled a gun on a man whose authority outranked his own. His partner, still holding the radio, looked visibly ill. The moment dispatch had confirmed Darius's identity, the young officer had taken a half step back, like a man realizing he had just walked into a minefield. "Agent King," Trent finally croaked, forcing the words out as if they burned his tongue. Darius held up a hand, silencing him instantly. His voice was low, controlled, deadly calm. "I want your badge numbers. Both of you." Trent's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. Karen's eyes widened, her panic doubling. This wasn't just an oops moment. This was serious. "Wait, hold on." She stepped forward, raising her hands in a pleading motion. "Darius, Agent King, I didn't mean for this to happen. I swear. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Darius let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly. The audacity. Even now she was trying to paint herself as the hero. Protect it from what, exactly? His voice was like ice. A black man walking into his own home. Karen's mouth flapped open, but no words came out. She had no answer. Because the truth, the ugly, undeniable truth, was that she never saw him as just a neighbor. She only saw what her bias wanted her to see. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. Darius turned back to the officers, his expression unreadable, but his next words sealed their fate. Turn your body cams off. A fresh wave of horror flashed across their faces. Body cams off. That only meant one thing. This wasn't staying on the street. This was going up the chain. Trent hesitated for half a second before reaching up and pressing a button on his vest. A tiny red light blinked off. His partner followed. Karen's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just going away. This was about to get worse. And for the first time, she understood. She had no control here. Darius took a step forward, closing the space between them. His presence loomed over her, not in threat, but in absolute, undeniable power. You're going to learn something today, Karen. His voice was softer now, but somehow more terrifying. Actions have consequences. Karen felt sick. She had made the biggest mistake of her life, and now she was going to pay for it. Karen spun around so fast it looked like she might collapse. Her face was ghostly pale, her hands gripping her chest, like she could physically hold in her panic. Wait, no, please. This is all just a misunderstanding, she shrieked, stepping closer to Darius, but the sharp look in his eyes froze her mid-step. Darius tilted his head, studying her. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. A misunderstanding. His voice was calm, controlled, but deadly. He let the words hang for a second, the weight of them crushing the air around them. Karen nodded frantically. Yes. I was just being a good neighbor. I was looking out for the community. A bitter chuckle rumbled from Darius's chest. A good neighbor? He echoed, stepping toward her. Karen flinched like he had struck her. His voice dropped lower, his words razor-sharp. A good neighbor welcomes people into the community. A good neighbor looks out for their own mistakes before calling in fake crimes. A good neighbor doesn't try to have an innocent man arrested just because he doesn't look like them. Karen's lips trembled, but no words came out. The neighbors, who had been silently watching from their porches, whispered amongst themselves. They weren't on her side anymore. A voice cut through the silence. I saw the whole thing. Everyone turned. It was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly white woman from 2 houses down. Her silver hair was pulled into a neat bun, her expression one of quiet disapproval. She crossed her arms, nodding toward Darius. I've seen this man every day, coming and going from that house. He waves at me when he picks up his mail. And you, Karen, you just embarrassed yourself in front of the entire block. Karen whirled toward her, rage flickering beneath her fear. I was just doing what any responsible citizen would do. Mrs. Henderson let out a scoff. No, dear. You were doing what a racist would do. The words hit like a slap. Karen stumbled back, her mouth hanging open, her face twisting between fury and horror. Darius let out a slow breath, before turning back to Officer Trent. You asked if I wanted to file an official complaint, he said, his voice steady. Trent swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Darius looked at Karen, her eyes shiny with unshed tears, her hands clutching herself like she could make this nightmare go away. Then finally, he made his choice. And it wasn't the one she was hoping for. Darius let the silence drag out, watching Karen squirm under the weight of her own mistake. Her eyes darted between him, the officers, and the neighbors. She was desperate, searching for someone, anyone, to back her up. But there was no one. She was alone. Darius finally exhaled, rolling his shoulders back, his presence unshaken. Then, he looked Trent dead in the eye. Yes, he said, his voice steady, powerful. I'd like to file an official complaint. Karen gasped sharply. No, please, you don't have to do this. She staggered forward, clasping her hands together like she was begging for mercy. I have a family, a job. I was just trying to do the right thing. Darius arched a brow. The right thing? His voice was like ice. The right thing would have been to mind your own business. The right thing would have been to walk across the street and introduce yourself when I moved in 3 years ago. Karen flinched, her lower lip trembling. But instead, he continued, his eyes narrowing, you saw a black man in your neighborhood, and your first instinct was to call the cops. And you didn't just call, you lied. Karen opened her mouth to protest, but Darius wasn't done. You put my life in danger today. Do you get that? Do you have any idea what could have happened? For the first time, Karen's face twisted with something real. Not guilt, not remorse, but the dawning horror that her actions could have cost a man his life. Officer Trent cleared his throat, trying to regain some authority. Sir, we'll need to take your statement down at the station. We take false reports very seriously. Karen spun to the officers, shaking her head violently. Wait! No, there has to be another way. I can apologize. We can handle this right here. Darius tilted his head slightly, pretending to think. Then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. Oh, don't worry, Karen. You'll get your chance to explain. At the hearing. Karen let out a strangled sound, somewhere between a sob and a scream. No, please, I didn't mean... Take her statement too, Darius said, nodding toward the officers. Make sure it's all in the report. Trent gave a short, embarrassed nod, already dreading the paperwork this would create. Karen was officially under investigation. As the officers radioed in their report, the street around them felt different now. The neighbors who had watched weren't whispering anymore. Some were shaking their heads. Others were quietly muttering about how they had suspected Karen's behavior for years. Karen saw it too. She wasn't just losing this fight. She was losing everything. Her reputation, her standing in the community, her sense of control. It was all slipping through her fingers. Darius, however, felt lighter. He had won. Not just for himself, but for every black man who had ever been falsely accused, every person who had been profiled, every innocent life ruined by people like her. This time, the truth won. And justice was just getting started. Karen stammered, her lips trembling as she tried to force out an explanation, any excuse that might make this nightmare go away. I just didn't recognize you, she pleaded, her voice cracking. I thought you were... A criminal? Darius cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. Karen froze, her mouth still open, but no words came. She knew, they all knew, that nothing she said could fix this. The neighbors, once her allies, now looked at her with disgust. Even Officer Trent, who had arrived thinking he was about to take down a suspect, now stood rigid with regret. Darius took another step forward, his calm more terrifying than rage. You saw a black man in a suit, getting out of a nice car, walking up to his own damn house. He tilted his head. Tell me, Karen, what part of that looked like a crime to you? Karen shook her head wildly, her eyes glistening. No, it's not like that. It's exactly like that. Darius's voice dropped, dangerously quiet now. Karen's hands clutched at her own arms, fingers digging into her skin. Her breathing turned erratic, like she was drowning on dry land. Please, I have a family, she whispered. I didn't mean to. Darius let out a slow, humorless chuckle. A family. His eyes darkened. You didn't think about my family when you tried to have me arrested. Karen choked on a sob. I swear, I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. A voice spoke up from behind her. Protect it from what, exactly? It was Mrs. Henderson again, her voice cold as ice. The elderly woman had lived in the neighborhood longer than anyone, and the look she gave Karen now was one of pure disappointment. Karen turned desperately to the older woman, as if begging for an ally. But Mrs. Henderson only shook her head. You should be ashamed of yourself. Karen staggered back, as if the words had physically struck her. The walls were closing in, and there was no escape. Karen stood there, her entire body shaking, eyes darting wildly between Darius, the officers, and the gathering crowd of neighbors. She could feel it now, the weight of what she had done, but there was no way out, no excuse, no more fake tears to erase what had already been set in motion. Darius inhaled deeply, his eyes never leaving her. He could see it, the desperation, the unraveling. She was breaking. Good. Karen clutched her arms, trying to keep herself from completely falling apart. Darius, please, she whispered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I swear. I'm not racist. Darius let out a slow, dark chuckle, shaking his head. Not racist? His voice cut through her like a blade. Karen, You called the police on a man standing at his own front door. You lied. You tried to have me arrested. And for what? Karen's breath hitched. She had no answer. Officer Trent's radio crackled to life. Unit 23. Confirm if charges are being filed for the false police report. Karen whirled toward the officers, her face pale as death. No, please. Please don't do this. I made a mistake. I'll do anything. Darius turned to Trent, his face unreadable. The officer swallowed hard. He was waiting for Darius's decision. Karen's fate was in his hands. For a long moment, the street was dead silent. Darius could feel every single eye on him. The entire neighborhood. The cops. Karen. He had all the power now. And then, he made his choice. Darius nodded once. Press the charges. Karen let out a blood-curdling sob, her knees nearly buckling beneath her. Officer Trent hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then reached for his radio. Copy that. We're processing charges now. Karen's world shattered. No! Please! She wailed, reaching out as if she could undo everything. I have a family. This will ruin me. Darius stared at her, his voice like steel and fire. You should have thought about that before you tried to ruin me. Karen's legs gave out, and she collapsed onto her porch in a heap, her sobs filling the air. But no one helped her. Not the neighbors, not the officers, and definitely not Darius. He turned without another word, walking back to his house where he belonged. As he reached his door, he paused, glancing back just once, not in pity, but in finality. This was justice. And Karen would never forget this day. Not for the rest of her life.